Okay, so now we're going to look at the Civil War as we make our way to the end of the class. The Civil War and then the period right after the Civil War. So we look just a general overview of the U.S. Civil War, and it is the U.S. Civil War because the Civil War can happen anywhere and has happened in many different places. What makes a civil war is it's a war between people within the same nation. So it's not two different nations or more fighting each other. A civil war is fought between different factions or different groups within the same country or nation. And so when we're talking about the US Civil War, it's the US versus kind of like the US. It's Americans versus Americans. It's not another country. Um, so kind of following up with the last lecture where we looked at the steps to the Civil War, the kinds of compromises the North and South made with each other, the free states, the slave states, arguing over whether there should be slavery in the new Western territories, and then Abraham Lincoln being elected president is what then ignites the Southerners to secede or break away, right? And they create their own country, the Confederacy, because they don't want Lincoln as their president. And the war actually gets declared after the South that broke away fires upon the U.S. Army at Fort Sumter. So the U.S. declares war on the states that seceded. Secede means to break away after Lincoln's election. So like secession has been threatened before. So South Carolina was the first state to secede for the Civil War. They had threatened to secede in the past also over laws about trade. Um, and like some people were like California should secede, or I believe after the 2016 election, or different pieces of land can try and break away, like the San Fernando Valley tried to secede from the city of Los Angeles, like, or parts of the San Fernando Valley tried to secede um, from the city of Los Angeles. So you can have one piece of land kind of try, and the people in that piece of land try to break their piece of land away from some other larger group. So like, you can have like, I don't know, there's Almani and then South Almani. A portion secedes and makes their own thing. So the Southerners seceded, some of the Southerners seceded, and then they attacked the U.S. Army. That leads to the U.S. declaring war. The war goes from April to April, April 1861 to April 1865. You may have read in school um, a novel called Across Five Aprils. It's when they talk about like 5 Aprils, it's the Civil War. When we're talking about the war, we're talking about, oftentimes people talk about North versus South. I mentioned that before, but it's really the USA versus those 11 southern states that seceded and created this Confederacy. So it's not really USA versus USA. It's Americans versus Americans. It's the USA Americans versus the Americans that wanted to break away from the US because they wanted to protect slavery and not have Lincoln or any other US government official threaten their right to have legal slavery. The first real battle of the Civil War was at Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run happened in July of 1861. So the U.S. declares war on the Confederacy in April. There's like, you know, planning and whatever happens. And the U.S. thought, okay, well, if these guys in the South are real serious, they're going to try and fight the U.S. Army and secede, so be it. And they thought that for sure the US Army, which was relatively powerful at the time, would be able to crush this, you know, hodgepodge confederacy that was thrown together quickly. But at the first battle, the US Army ended up retreating from the Confederate soldiers. And then people realized, oh, we underestimated these people in the South and the Confederacy. It's going to be a much more difficult war than we thought. I mean, like people even packed like picnics to like sit on a hill to, oh, we're going to see the U.S. Army put on a show, and like put down these, secesh Southerners or whatever. Didn't happen that way because the South had actually a lot of strengths that the U.S. had underestimated. The U.S. tried to take Richmond, which was established as the capital of the Confederacy. So you have D.C. as the U.S. capital and not too far away because D.C. is right on the border of Virginia and Maryland. And not too far away, you had Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. The U.S. tried to take the capital and failed. Um, but eventually, after 4 years of fighting and lots of people dead and wounded, the Confederates surrendered at Appomattox, right outside Richmond, Virginia. So when we talk about the Civil War, this is what the map looked like in terms of who's versus who. The blue are all the states that were the USA that didn't secede, didn't break away. So it's not just the North. You also have the West. And then you have all this yellow here. These were all US territories that hadn't become states yet. So states would be organized once enough Americans moved there and they organized the land with US, government laws. So essentially all yellow was still US territory. You have the organized states in the West. And then you have some states that still had slavery but didn't break away. So like Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, all of these states were slaveholding states, but they didn't break away from the US. They were called the border states. They were like the border of the US territories before you got into, Dixie, into the South, the Confederacy. All the purple, these are the states where the people seceded and became the Confederate states and flew the Confederate flag and didn't want to be part of the US anymore in order to have the right to continue slavery without federal government interference. All right, so let's look at the North, quote unquote North, and the South. So when we're talking about the North, we mean the USA in the Civil War. And of course, their president was Abraham Lincoln. It's his election that sparked the secession of the South. There's Abe Lincoln there. Some nicknames of the North during the Civil War, and people kind of still use these terms. The Union, right? The United States, the Union States. So they talked about Union soldiers. And then Americans have had the nickname Yankees or Yanks since the time of the colonies. So British people would call the American colonists Yankees, like Yankee Doodle Dandy. Um, and then over time, Yankees kind of became synonymous with just Americans, like USA Americans. Of course, Americans can be North and South America, but USA Americans. Um, and then during the Civil War, because the Southerners no longer were going to be Americans, they were no longer going to be part of the USA, they referred to anyone that was still in the USA, primarily in the North, as Yankees. So they became Yankees or Yanks. Um, the U.S. Army had several different generals heading different, trying to create strategies and campaigns for defeating the South. But ultimately, it's General Ulysses S. Grant who is going to be the general when the U.S. wins the Civil War. And there he is. He eventually rides his fame from being the general of that wins the Civil War into the presidency, which we see not so much anymore, but in the past, we often saw generals then kind of climb the ladder to becoming president, which makes sense because, of course, the president is the commander in chief of the military. Um, so people think like, the presidents make laws and stuff. They don't, they do executive orders, but their primary job is to be in charge of the military and use the military to enforce the law. Okay, so anyway, the general from the Civil War was General Grant. He's on the $50 bill now. The uniform color of the United States traditionally is blue, right? In contrast to like during the American Revolution, the red coats from Britain. And of course, fighting during the Civil War was old-timey fighting, like left over from European tradition, where it's like one side lines up on one part of the field, the other side lines up on the other side of the field. They stand there, and then it's kind of like go, right? And then they just start running at each other and shooting and fighting or whatever. Um, Obviously, over time, that kind of fighting has changed with the advancements in technology, weaponry. You don't want to just stand out in a field and wait for someone to shoot you, right? So, and that a lot of that comes from adopting guerrilla warfare tactics from people from around the world, right? So the places the U.S. colonized, the people would often fight the U.S. with guerrilla warfare tactics, meaning you use the environment around you, so you're not just standing in the middle of a field waiting to be shot, right? You like hide, you set traps, ensnare your enemy, like that kind of thing, which is why people now wear camouflage, um, out in war. But like in ceremony and stuff, the U.S. still uses a blue uniform, like, formal kind of uniform. And then, of course, the U.S. flew the U.S. flag. It didn't have 50 stars back then because there weren't 50 states, but like what, 30 some stars on the flag, but the same stars and stripes with the 13 stripes for the 13 original colonies, and then however many stars for however many states there are. Some of the strengths the U.S. had going into the Civil War: money. That's really important when you're fighting a war, as we saw in the war between the US and Mexico, right? You need money to pay soldiers, buy supplies, buy weapons, um, provide transportation, etc. So the US had a lot of money in comparison to the Confederacy, which wasn't a country, it was just like these southern states. Though the southern states did have some, access to money because of um, the wealth from cotton and slavery. Um, but during the Civil War, the US tried to cut off um, the Confederacy's trade of cotton with Europe. So it's like European nations were like, okay, you're allied with the United States, don't buy cotton from the Confederacy. And so kind of cut them off there. The US had strengths in manufacturing. Most of the manufacturing was in the northern cities. So, manufacturing of weapons, ammunition, supplies for soldiers. Um, the South really lacked that stuff. The North had more people, right? Again, cities. A lot of the immigrants who came to the United States came to the northern parts, the Midwest and the East Coast of the North. And there's just more people up there that then could be pulled into the army either voluntarily or through the draft. And then we have the South. The official name of the South was the Confederate States of America. That's the name they chose for themselves, and they put into their own, like Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and they even printed their own money. Different states in the South printed their own money because they weren't going to use U.S. money anymore. Um, and they put Confederate States of America in there. They elected their own president, a guy named Jefferson Davis, who had been a senator in the U.S. Congress, and then switched sides. He went with his home state, I believe, of Virginia, which happened for a lot of people, right? So this war broke out. Some people were in the North, in the U.S. government, in the U.S. military. The war breaks out. They're from the South. They're like, I'm not going to go and fight like my family members that live there. So they left and they became part of the Confederacy. But then also there are folks who were slave owners who were like slavery or death, right? Like, so they chose their side. Some nicknames of the South, they were the Secession because they seceded, or Secesh for short, Confederacy, and then they were also called the Rebels because they were the rebel states. They had rebelled against the United States to secede, um, which caused the war, right? So there's like a character, Johnny Rebel. Sometimes high schools and stuff use that person as their mascot. I don't know why, but they do. But that comes from the time of the Civil War. There are even schools in the South and statues and streets and parks and stuff that are named after Confederate leaders like Jefferson Davis. These guys led like a war against the USA, committed treason essentially. Um, but it's a thing. It's a thing in the South. There's a whole school of thought that was created in the 1920s and 30s to try to rewrite the history of the South, called the Lost Cause, kind of like revision to try and kind of rewrite the history of the Civil War away from a focus on the Southerners trying to defend slavery and losing, to looking at like defending local states' rights to have slavery. But like that was like the revision, and it was taught for a long time, and it still is taught in a lot of places in the South. And there are a lot of people who are adults, voting age adults, who learn that in school, that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and slavery wasn't that bad, and it was about northern aggression against the South and not letting the states decide what they wanted to do. And so people named things after Confederate people. There's, that's been a controversy in terms of statues to some of these folks like Robert E. Lee, who was a general. He had been a general in the US Army and then went back to his home state of Virginia to lead the army. Southerners wore gray in contrast to the US blue. And of course, they flew many different flags, but the flag that's most identified with the Confederacy is this flag. Also controversial because it's the flag that only existed in order for the South to secede to keep slavery. Only flew for these 4 years, and yet people say this represents the heritage of the South. controversial slavery.